It's good to see you guys. It's good to be back in person. I'm glad we do not have to do this virtually again like we did last year. So I'm glad to see you all this morning. And so my name is Melissa Carlson. For those of you who maybe don't know me, I'm the On-Farm Research Coordinator for Minnesota Wheat's On-Farm Research Network. And we're going to talk about some of our results that we got from our trials this year. All right. Some of you guys have seen that already. So we're going to be using our phones today. So if you guys want to pull out your phones and get those handy, we're going to be doing some interactions during the presentations today. So just to get everybody started off, I want everybody to give a shout out to where you're representing from this morning. Where did you guys all drive in from this morning? Good to see we got some good representation from the area this morning. So just to get started, again, it's the On-Farm Research Network. The On-Farm Research Network is funded by the Wheat Checkoff, so this is the Wheat Checkoff dollars at work. We also are funded with grants by the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council, with the MDA and with AFREC, which is the fertilizer checkoff. So our on-farm trials, if you're not familiar with how we're doing them, or if you haven't done any kind of script trials or research in your field, you're probably familiar with maybe university trials, how those are conducted with small plots, either on the research station or out in a farmer's field maybe. They're usually like 5 by like 20 feet, so very small plots, lots of treatments, whereas our on-farm trials, we use your equipment to put these trials out in the field. So using your planters and your combines to replicated strip trials out in the field. And so in 2021, we looked at wheat seeding rates, light-weight fungicide, nitrogen stabilizers, continuing with our on-combine protein mapping project, and the rotational long-term elevated PK project. And also we have one more site with our green seeding soybean into a rye cereal crop, or cereal cover crop. So that is kind of what we were looking at this season. And so I'm sure you guys are going to hear all about this all winter. Lessons from the 2021 season. It was dry. And so we had our research plots did okay. Most of the locations were in areas that did get more rain, that maybe kind of that Crookston Deep River band that didn't get any rain. But because of the drought affecting the research plots, today we're going to focus a little bit more on just the 2021 locations and how they responded to the dryness, rather than combining that dry data with the rest of our data. And so the first thing that we'll talk about, you guys can follow along in your books if you'd like. These slides, these tables will go in order of what's in the book. So we're going to talk about wheat seeding rates. So first question I have for you guys today, real quickly, is what rate do you guys typically seed wheat on at your farm? So with this trial, in the past we looked at seeding rates of 1.5, and 2 million plants per acre. In the last 2 years, we've dropped it down to 3/4, 1.25, 1.75 plants per million plants per acre. So if you guys are seeding by million plants per acre, you can answer there. If you guys are still going by bushels, you can put that one in at the bottom. So it looks like most of us are seeding below, or I should say most of us. Most of you guys are seeding below that 1.5 million rate, which is right about what the university is recommending. The University of Minnesota recommends about 1.3 to 1.4 million seeds per acre for their varieties. And so I mentioned the rates that we were using this season. Varieties that we looked at this season were 9590, Balda, Washburn, and we also had 3 sites in Torquay to test that out this year also. Put this up just for location data, but it's in your booklet to look at. Mostly I just wanted to comment that I did add total rainfall for all the sites in the book for all of our research trials, and those are just estimated based off the Iteris clear ag model, so those are estimated rainfall. Obviously, there's going to be some variability with what the field actually received. So before we kind of look at the data, I'm kind of curious to see what you guys think. How do you guys expect seeding rates to respond to a drought? What would you expect to see if you're planting into dry conditions? Do you bump the seeding rate up, anticipating high stand losses from the dry conditions? Or do you think maybe you're hoping that maybe a lower seeding rate will help reduce plant-to-plant competition between the individual wheat plants? We got a lot of answers for B, although I'm not sure if that's because maybe you guys thought that before, maybe you were looking ahead at the yield data, I'm not sure. But I think when I going into the season, I think I would have gone with A, having higher seeding rates, doing a little bit better in the dry year. But so when we look at our yield data, not a lot of significant differences, but when we're looking at individual location data, we can kind of, and we can anticipate that. It's very hard when you only have 3 replications, and looking at a single field, there's just not a lot of data points, and it's very hard to find statistical significance when you're just looking at one location, which is why the on-farm network focuses on combining locations, so we can increase that number of data points. But I think kind of the story from this year is even with the dry conditions, that low rate of only 750,000 plants per acre, which is less than 100 pounds. I can't remember the exact pound. The poundage is going to vary, but it's definitely less than 100 pounds when you're planting. It actually did pretty dang good. It kept up really well with those higher rates. We didn't have any, and Red Lake Falls location was actually the lowest rate, actually did the better, or did the best. And that location was kind of in that band that got toasted this year. So that trial really got toasted. It didn't get much rain, and so I think that's why the lowest rate did the best, is less plant-to-plant competition with that lowest seeding rate. But I think, so this summer there was a lot of talk about weed control, what to do about our herbicides. And I think that we got these results this year because we didn't have the weed pressure that we normally do this season. So looking at that Red Lake Falls location, it was 95-90 this year, and just looking at last year's results, same farm, same variety, same seeding rates, different field obviously. That lowest rate yielded almost 10 bushels less than the other rates, and that was because of weed pressure. That lower rate has a very thin stand when it's coming up, and it doesn't fill in obviously as quite as much as the other rates, and so that had a lot of weed pressure. So I think our results from this year are not really representative of what you're going to see obviously in a normal year, obviously from the dryness and also from the lack of weed pressure. It's usually you're going to have you would end up with more yield loss with that lower rate because of weed pressure. So I think that's kind of the story from these location data. One other thing that I did kind of notice that was interesting, looking at the harvest moisture for the individual locations. At some of the locations, you can see that the harvest moisture was a point higher for that lowest seeding rate, and it kind of corresponds to what we saw in the field. Hopefully you can make out from the pictures, there's definitely a defined green line, and that's the difference between the lowest rate, that 750,000 plants per acre, and the other rates. I guess I didn't look up which other rates for those two sites was on the other side of it. So in the middle there, you can see that's the green band there. And that was taken in July. And those, the lowest seeding rates stayed greener for longer and had a lot more tillers. I think that because of that, to reduce competition for what available soil moisture it was. so yeah, so we had a lot of tillering. I think I wanted to highlight this, your yield table. I made a mistake in your book. So in your yield table, you can scribble it out. I think in bold that's highlighted as significant, but it should not be. That's what I wanted to know with this page was here with the yields. But when we're combining the locations within 2021, combining the locations, still no statistical differences evening out, just because we were tillering so much with that lowest rate. So when you kind of browse through the stand data, the established stand, we obviously had huge differences in established stand among the seeding rates, but that really showcases the tillering capacity. I can switch back here. The tillering capacity. Well, anyway, you can see it in the book. Really showcases the tillering capacity of wheat when it doesn't have weed pressure or disease pressure holding it back. It can really tiller out, and so that lowest seeding rate really produced a lot of heads to almost just about keep up with the higher seeding rates. There it goes. You can see this picture here. You can kind of make out that the very far left is the lowest seeding rate. There's about 7 heads on each of those wheat plants compared to 3 or 4 on the other rates. But again, so you can see on the right, though, that's a very thin stand that doesn't fill in during the season. So that's kind of what I have for summarizing kind of what we saw in 2021. Obviously, because of the reduced moisture and the lack of weed pressure, I didn't want to combine it with our other year's data. But I did have Kyle Jory, who's with Pennington County Extension, help me with some economic analyses on some of the seed rate data that we've had from the last few years. So I'm going to turn it over to him to talk for a few minutes about his economic analysis.
Hi, thank you. So yeah, I work with Pennington County Extension, and then I also I've been working with the University of Minnesota for some time, and I just accepted a position, so I'm actually moving to work for a consulting firm, Watson Associates, starting in January. But I've been helping Missy out last year, and then this year as well. She sent me some data, so just to update roughly what we're seeing overall in terms of seeding rates. This kind of gives you an idea of the last 5 years total put together. So in the graph that I have here, this is roughly giving a picture of stand loss by seeding rate. As you might expect, what we're seeing here, so this is all the data points. I just put them on there just so you get an idea. By variety, and then I fit curves to these data points to give a rough idea of where the response rate is, and you can see they're all sloping up, which means that as the seeding rate increases, which would be the axis along the bottom there, stand loss increases. So you have poorer emergence as you increase your seeding rate. The rate at which it goes up for every 100,000 seeds that go by stand loss will be maybe about just under 8,000 seeds will be lost as you increase your seeding rate. You can kind of get a little sense of the variation among the varieties here. So I'll let you look at that in the sheet there. This is a little bit more interesting. This is overall in terms of optimal yield rates. So we have yield data for all of these different samples, and there's repetition here, of course, as well. And so I fit some curves, just quadratic curves. You can see they're pretty flat. So there's not huge variations in yield as we increase or decrease our seeding rates. But it's interesting to note that there is quite a bit of variation among the different varieties. So if we're looking to optimize yield, I do have in the center, you can see it just says best estimate. I pooled everything together just to get an idea of what it would be if we just ignored variety. Turns out it hits 1.4 right on the spot, which ironically enough is exactly the extension recommendation. And it's not because of this is just happened to come out to be the same. But as far as the other varieties are concerned, there's some that probably stand out. Torgy, and we just started that's just this year now, right? So Torgy came out at a pretty high seeding rate, 95-90. So pushing those varieties is going to make a big impact on your yield. Balda ended up being I was surprised at that. But if you look at all across the board, it's high, so you can have small variation there, so fairly high rates or high yields. Laying has always been recommended to be seeded a lot lower, and that shows up. I wouldn't actually seed at 0.49. That's terrible. That's like outside the data set, but gives you a picture of where that's at. So you can look at that if you want.
And so we, just a comment on that, so we included the number of locations.
Let's go back, I can.
Oops, sorry. Well, on each of the slides, we included the number of locations that are in the data set, just to help interpret. So the varieties with only a few locations, so Lang, Torby, they only have 3 locations, so those results aren't going to be as reliable, say, as Linkert or Valda, which have 10 total locations. Just as an aside note.
We did the same thing last year, and it was interesting to know the numbers did change a little bit. Like 95 and 90 was a lot higher seeding rate last year. And then I noticed this year when we added it, it brought it back into where closer to where I would have expected it to have been. But yeah, as we increase the number of trials, that'll improve those numbers. So this picture, I don't like to do these kinds of diagrams, but there's a reason for it. This is presuming fixed costs. I just threw a $500 across the board. We know that every variety is going to demand different, and yields are going to demand different, and you're going to fertilize more of those varieties that are going to have higher yields, and so it's not really, it's sort of an apples and oranges sort of thing. So don't think about variety variations in terms of which one might potentially profit you more. But I wanted to get a sense of what this means in terms of a market price. So if we're looking at an optimal seeding rate, like we saw in the previous slide, where is our break even? And so the picture here, and I wish I could show you all, but I'm talking about that dotted line down at the bottom there. That's your break even point. So at these optimal seeding rates, we're still going to need to see market prices somewhere between $7 and $8, somewhere in there, right, as a break even. Over that, then we're looking at a better profitable scenario. But again, there's lots of variation there, fixed costs. So I don't look at that and immediately assume that, you know, are you going to profit more off of bulb than bolls? Well, maybe if you're buying bolls or something, maybe, but gives you an idea of the break-evens. This optimal is a little bit more interesting. This is the one that I'm interested in. This is not yield optimal. This is not the agronomic approach. This would be like the economic optimal. So in other words, where am I going to be profit optimizing? And it turns out, this is a very fundamental principle of economics, it will be at a value that is below what your agronomic optimal will be. That is presuming some diminishing returns. So here you can see as market price changes, roughly where should your seeding rate be for the different varieties. And there's some variation in here. You know, well, again, Valda, we only just started it this year, but that came in at a much lower seeding rate than I was expecting. Torgy was quite high, 95-90 is fairly high. But in all of these, that agronomic optimal is quite a bit higher. So the lesson here is this: unless we're going to see really high prices, market prices, I would say at the current prices for these varieties, and I didn't make that comment, but it was up here earlier. Last year we were looking at like $9 to $12 or so for seed price. This year it's going to be a lot more. It's going to be $14, maybe up to $16 for seed prices. As these things increase, you need to start to think about the possibility of backing off. And you're going to see a response. You're going to see that yield response. Maybe not as high a yield, but you're certainly going to see a better profitable response. And I guess that's the message I was trying to get through here. Now, if you're concerned about your APH and that sort of thing, you know, by all means, spend money to do that if you think you're going to be collecting later. But otherwise, this should give you an idea of where potentially you want to see seeding rates in terms of going forward. In a price, I would say, yeah, generally speaking, we should back off.
Say whenever you was planting 750,000 versus say 1.5 million or 1.75, what made you determine how to plant it? Was it say pre-moisture, whenever you were sampling and stuff like that, or what was it exactly?
So are you asking, how did we determine what seeding rates to test? Okay, so for determining the seeding rates that we were testing, we just wanted to get a range of possible seeding rates that farmers would be using. So originally, when we started this study, we had a range from 1 million to 2 million, which kind of covered most bases, but we were never getting any differences, no yield differences. So we actually dropped it back down to $750,000. I'm actually trying to find the bottom, trying to maybe see some yield decreases to actually confirm where, where a bottom would be.
And Missy, you maybe just talk really quick, your committee that helps you provide the ideas or the seed rate too. Because I think at one time we talked like, oh, we should seed 1 million, 1.25, 1.5. And I know someone had said, let's drop that as low as we can go, to 0.75. So it was pretty good for our input too to get the range.
Yes, and Chris brings that up because Chris is also on our farm advisory committee. So yeah, and so we're trying to get a range, and I'm not just the only one that decides what we're doing. I also have an on-farm advisory committee. They are listed on the back of your booklet, and so it's consultants, university folks, farmers. We kind of get together to kind of get a consensus of what farmers are wanting to see in research, and then decide on what specific projects we're going to do throughout the year and the protocols that we're going to use for those projects. All right. One more question, and then we'll...
Yeah, maybe you addressed it, I might have missed it, but in the economic part of it, did you take into consideration protein and for the different varieties?
In the model, we controlled for a lot of that. So I did a regression model, and then I had fixed effects that included protein and the year, for example, to take out variations in weather. But there is an effect on protein that would be actually more interesting, I think. So what you're getting at too is maybe the fact that we should be regressing these things on protein levels. So right now the response variable that with the economic side that I was just focused on was just the yield response, because that's the market price response, but that's not true. There's also market price response to protein levels, and that part wasn't taken into consideration as a response. But putting that in and considering discounts and that sort of thing would probably be a reasonable approach, yeah.
All right, one more question.
You saw the bull population being, was that more attributed to plant health, or was it more attributed to just the tillage being slower?
Okay, gotcha. So the first part of his question, so when I showed the picture of the lower population staying more green throughout or during the season at several locations, wondering if that's actually due to plant health or just the tillers being later or farther along. And that's a good question. I did not, I guess, examine that a little closer. It didn't cross my mind, but now that you mention it, that would have been a really good thing to kind of stage the tillers and where they were at compared to the other ones. So that, yeah, no, that is a good question to think about. And maybe if the tillers were farther along, and maybe that was why there's a little slightly higher moisture in the harvest too, that could be. So that was a good question. All right, looks like the general consensus is that we've got seeding rates down, I think. A little bit less to talk about here this year. So we've been doing flyleaf fungicide research for the last few years. And while I introduce this one, I got a question. How many fungicide passes do you guys use on your beet in a normal year? Are you going over once, twice, 3 times, or just really depends on the year? So we've been doing this trial, so looking at kind of what we would consider our normal fungicide regime, which also appears to be what you guys are using also. So putting herbicides or a fungicide on with herbicides and tillering, and then also a scab timing fungicide. So that was our control. And so our treatment would be adding the 3rd fungicide in, on at flyleaf, which it looks like nobody in this room is doing. So that is something interesting to be talking about. Okay, so we do have one. We'll add a little bit of bar there, a little bar to the number 3. All right, so like I said, so we're looking at kind of 2 fungicides versus a 3 fungicides regime, adding that flyleaf fungicide. In the year, varieties that we've done in the past. We're looking at Balda, Spitfire, 9479 and 9590, and Mayville. We originally started this project just looking at Mayville because it has such poor disease tolerance and it responds fairly well to a flagging fungicide. This year, our varieties, we were able to get 4 sites on. The wheat, if you guys might recall, the wheat pushed along very fast, and so it was actually hard to get the fungicides on because the wheat went so fast. But we did get 1 site of 9479 on, and the rest were actually rolled up. The other 90, we were shooting for 9590 sites, but they weren't able to get on. And so what we saw this year was that you don't apply fungicides when there's no disease pressure. Kind of what we already knew. But one thing, we kind of had a question, well, maybe, if it's dry, there's no disease pressure, maybe is there still that kind of green up, that plant health green up effect, which is not the case of what we saw this year. And we actually had lower yield in that Crookston location that's highlighted, actually had a significantly, like a bushel, almost 2 bushels less with flyleaf fungicide treatment. And I asked Joachim Wiersma about that, why maybe a fungicide application might decrease yield, and he had no idea either, so not really sure what to say about that one. But since I didn't really have much to talk about this year, I just wanted to kind of remind you guys what we've done, seen in past years. So this is our 2018, 2019, 2020 data that I presented on last year. With the different varieties that we were looking at, we did have significant yield increases with the flagleaf fungicide application. In Mayville, which we would expect, it's got very poor disease tolerance, but also in Balda, which actually has a higher disease tolerance rating. So that was a little bit surprising. It's interesting to see. And so with that increased yield, we also then that stay green effect, also seeing a little bit of increased moisture in general at harvest with that increased slight go up in yield. Kind of our partial profit, my partial profit analysis isn't quite as in-depth as Kyle's, but our partial profit analysis from last year that we did on prior year's data, on average we're getting a 2 or 3 bushel yield increase on average with the fungicide trial, but using Reactor, which tends to be a more expensive fungicide, that wasn't quite paying for itself. So the point being, when we do have a normal year with disease pressure, there is a chance that there's, on average, you might get a 2 or 3 bushel increase with that flagleaf fungicide pass. But whether or not it pays off for itself is going to depend on the magnitude of your yield response and which chemicals you are using. So farmers usually ask us, why are you using Characterizing? Can you use something cheaper? For our experiment, that's just the chemical that we used. But if you can make something else work on your farm that's a little bit cheaper, then by all means give it a try. Just try to keep in mind rotating your modes of action. That's why we chose Reactor, was to make sure we were rotating modes of action with the fungicides. Before we move on to the next presenter, does anybody have any questions about the fungicide trial?
Misty, what were the other growers in the room spraying at flagleaf? I don't know if there's any Fisher guys or anybody, just kind of curious.
Does anybody want to volunteer what they were throwing at flagleaf? Or Ryan, you had mentioned.
Pre-Axor.
Gotcha. Okay, I got one. Somebody's tried headline. Another person up here has tried headline. And there was a lot of research on that about 10 years ago, using headline. Yeah, so that's not a year for fungicide research. We'll just chalk it up to that.
I think what I'll do is I've got a lot of background slides here. I may go through the Cliffs version unless someone really wants to get a lot of the background. I'll do some of it, but I think I'll speed through to the end. But this is the first question. If you apply a starter fertilizer in wheat or soybeans as a common practice, and with the projected prices that I'm hearing for fertilizer, there may be more interest in banding, possibly. It's just food for thought. So like I said, my name is Dave Grafstrom. I'm a research agronomist working at the University of Minnesota Magnuson Research Farm in Roseville. You guys say, what do you do in Roseville? Well, we had a meeting yesterday, a canola meeting, so we raised some canola. Around the coffee pot, guys, we're talking about minus 10, 15, kind of bragging who's the coldest. The guy said, well, we don't care, we're making ice, or ice fishing. You want to get out of the ice and lake of the woods on the big lake and catch some fish. Just like we were talking about in Roseville yesterday. So what I'm going to talk about is just kind of a little bit of background on what we did and why. So you say, well, we want to establish a long-term rotational trial with soybeans and wheat. We want to combine some small plot with large plot. And really wanted to look at elevated levels of P and K. We had just a fantastic partnership with this project. It doesn't happen very often. It was about 3 years in the making to pull this together. So looking at AFRAC, which is the Fertilizer Council, Minnesota wheat growers, soybean growers, University of Minnesota, and farmer cooperators. And really was a good group to work with, and we got 1 more year in the project. So, small plots, you guys have heard about those, you know what they do. We try to do with small plots, we try to minimize variability. Find a uniform plot in the field, put our small plots that are 5 by 20, replicate those a number of times. So we're really trying to minimize variability. Well, in the real world, what do? We can't minimize variability. We're going to try to manage for variability. So that's where the partnering with the small plots and the large plot comes into play. In small plots, we do a lot of it. We try to minimize that variability and see what we have. So we've got both. This slide tells you why we proposed this research in the first place. USDA District 10 goes from Roseland and Kinston County down to Fargo. In 2007, between the decade 2007 and 2017, an increase of 700,000 acres of soybeans. Look at the yield. Why were the yields in soybeans, why didn't they change anything? Not sure. Wheat yields changed about 15 bushels. Now there's no question that soybeans in the wheat rotation make wheat better, for sure. But beans, what's the challenge with beans? We don't know, so we thought, well, maybe it's P and K. Where I live, when beans are coming in the area, guys say, well, what do you fertilize beans? Well, they scavenge pretty well. We don't have to put anything on. Then it got to be, well, you got to put a little bit, maybe a 7-30-30. It's good enough. Is that good enough? Well, if you want to raise 30 bushel beans, it is. So that's kind of where we're at. So I'm going to kind of speed through some of these, but the last bullet, the 7-30-30, isn't enough if you want high yields like this. And this chart will tell you, in the 3 years of our small plot research in wheat, we ranged from 60 to 82 bushels. That was the range in yield. So a low would be 34 pounds of P2O5, a high of 47. On the K side, 20 to 27. Look at soybeans on the other side. Our low was 46 bushels. Our high was 62. So how much P and K is that going to need required to produce that? Well, 46 can be 34 pounds of P2O5 and 54 of K2O. You go with that 60 plus bushel, you're going to be 46 of P2O5 and 73. That's what the textbook tells us. So that's why we're saying, are we where we want to be? We've got the dry mouth coming on here. And just as a side, our local fertilizer plant tells me that in the last 3 years, they went from applying 30 units of P and 30 units of K before beans. This year, a lot of guys are going 11, 52, 60 before beans. Not sure what you guys do. That's kind of what we're doing up north. And, we're happy to get 60, but 50 is pretty good for us. And so we're raising fair quality. Now, I'm going to speed through the rest of these myths for time so I don't get the hook. These two guys just want to when I think about soil science, the Justus von Liebig, the barrel state concept, basic soil science, very good principle. Arthur Wallace talked about the law of the maximum. And I'm going to speed through these, but some other time we can talk about that. But really the goal of this, von Liebig said, is you want those barrel slats to be at the top. So whatever you can do to satisfy the nutrient you want, that's where you're going to get the highest yield possible. If you have one of those nutrients that are missing, that's going to cap your yield. So I'm going to get to the specifics. Here's a small plot, pretty typical stuff. Randomized complete block. We've managed for 80 bushel wheat, 50 bushel soybeans. The Magus environment, it's an aerial shot of where it's at, 48 per site. Here's the people that work up there. The large plot, we see kind of coordinates that. Growing season, Mrs. Duck goes hot. You don't see that 100 degrees in Rosa County very often. So we were hot, we were dry, we were about half normal precip, cracks in the ground, Missy talked about that. We had 2 sites, wheat and soybeans, 15 treatments, well 16 with it untreated. We used 20, 40, 60, 80, and 100 units of each, and then the combination. It was a spring fly. So there it is. What was the soil type at this site? Site 1, you see it there, they're both still loams. The main difference between site 1 and 2, site 1 has a low tested P, 6 parts per million. Site 2 was high, 23. And we chose those on purpose to see what would happen over time. So these are the results, the wheat results. So the LSD, the confidence level for yield is 7, and the CV is 5.8, which is very good for small plot field research. Gives us a pretty good confidence level in this data. So, and this was the low testing P site. So you can see in 2021, you put on an extra 20, you put 20 units of P, you got 12 bushel back. You put 40 units of P, you got about 20 bushel. Higher than that, you still got about 20. So on this low testing P site, if you put on less than 40, you were hurting yourself. And we saw that show up in the soil test and the tissue test. And the numbers are in the book there if you want to look at it. This, real quickly, is telling what happened in 2019, the first year of the trial, to this year. Just suffice to say that you see those peaks, we're building P levels. Some guys say, well, if the fertilizer price is cheap, I want to build my soil level. Can I do that? Well, it looks like we had to be above 60, between 60 and 100 we could build, based on what we took out. Combination, a little bit less, but combination, so you can build P levels quite nicely. K levels, what do we do there? In our site we looked at, we couldn't build, it stayed pretty flat. The soybean results, this year we had 46 bushel yield was our, in our site. No difference on anything we did, none of the P and K rates. Because of this. We had more, blessed to have more beans than others, but the top beans dried out. Top pods had maybe 1 or 2 seeds, not 3 we like to see. So that's kind of what, in this trial, the beans just kind of dried up. So any response to additional fertilizer with the yield capped where it is, we wouldn't expect to see it. to the large plots work. That was also hot and dry. Up a lot of place where I live, there's gravel streets and you can see them quite often. This year they were everywhere, in all kinds of crops. Use fuel, like Ms. Paulo used regular, real world equipment to do these trials. The scale on the grain card has been a fantastic thing for us. We used to, and we still use weigh wagons, right? But I've used a lot of the on-farm work I do, regardless of crop, if it's soybeans or wheat or ryegrass, whatever the crop is, the scale on the grain cards have been fantastic. It really helps us do what we want to do. And for the most part, guys are using the scale anyway, so it's not a real project. Post-harvest soil sampling we do. And this year we had 4 wheat sites, 1 soybean site. The information in your book on where they were at. What did we find? Basically, on the wheat, 1 of 4 sites showed a response to additional P and K. It's about 25% of the locations. Really didn't have an impact on protein or testing. I guess you want to come up on wheat now. And the soybeans just had 1 site, no difference there either, but with the yields, of mid-40s, I guess that's not. We'd like to see a little bit higher if we're going to see responses to the elevated levels of PK. So I think, due to time, the basic take-home message was, in the small plots, we had a range of wheat from 60 to 80 this year. We had 12 bushel more from putting 20 units of P. We had 20 from putting 40. More than that, we didn't see additional response this year. So we asked, well, how if you had 100 bushel? How if you had 100 bushel wheat? Maybe. The more you produce, the more it's going to take, right? So you got to sometimes give what Mother Nature lets us. So there was no treatment difference in protein or test weight, but this year for us, in the small plots, with protein of 16 to 17, that's really unheard of for us. That's fantastic protein. So the large plot, like I said, 1 wheat, 1 soybean, moderate to extreme drought in all locations, I would say. You see the wheat range. And 1 to 5 locations, about 20%, we saw a benefit from additional gains. With that, I will entertain a question or two. And gentlemen in the back, Missy, she'll come talk to you. If you got one of the sites in your place, that'd be fantastic.
Area where phosphorus is going to pay off.
The question was, where do you think in the case of soybeans, what level of phosphorus do you have to have? And did I paraphrase that right?
We're in an area that seldom makes a 50 bushel yield in soybeans, or west central. So are we ever going to see a payoff in phosphorus, or do you need to see like yield from 60 and above to get that?
So the question was, in areas that you have a yield goal of 40-ish beans, does it pay to put high levels of P and K? And I would say probably not. Look at what your soil test tells you, what your expected yield goal is. If there's a shortfall there, because the textbook tells us how much P and K the beans are going to need, right? So you take that information, your soil test information. If there's a gap there, absolutely for sure, it's fun. But if your yield goal is mid-40s, to shoot the moon P and K probably is not a wise idea, especially what the projected fertilizer prices are come 2022. That answer? Anyone else?
Do you guys know, like, with were gonna do a cover crop, what the, like the conservation programs and stuff to go out and do a sweet clover or buckwheat or, whatever, turnips and all that, what the, return is on that for fertilizer? Like, have you tested what, if you put sweet clover in, the amount of P and K that you get back? Because we're going into some dry years here, maybe we're in a dry cycle now, for the conservation of moisture in that, it would be really, beneficial for everybody to understand what the returns are on those, procedures.
Right, I'll just, you'll answer, but I'll just say one thing. At the Magazine Farm, we're starting some of that research just for the question you posed. We've done a little bit of work, and what we can tell, what we can say thus far is, a lot of times a cover crop, what do you think of a cover crop? Buy the cheapest seed, just throw it out there, but that's all we need. If you want the cover crop to really grow and produce, you have to treat it like a crop. You say, well, Dave, you want me to fertilize a cover crop, P and K? If you want it to grow, absolutely. If you're in an area, especially if you're kind of marginal P and K, you absolutely have to do that. Because if you want the cover crop to go for the winter, what do the turf guys tell us? What do they put on in the fall to get the turf nice and green in the spring? Help the winter come. P and K, right? They always put P and K on in the fall. So for us, if we're going to raise the cover crop, to me it's treating that like a crop you want to survive over the winter, and treat that the best you can in the fall will give you the best chance not only of surviving, but of thriving the next year. So I would really check and say that's really what we want to do. Treat that as a crop.
Are you going to follow up with another cropping on those same plots this year to see what the elevated P might do to a year later?
The question was you're going to continue this? We are, and this will be the fourth year of the same plot gets 20 units of P every year. 20, 20, 20. One gets 40, 40, 40 of P. Same thing of K, and the combination. So we're going to have a heavy dose, 100 of P and 100 of K on the highest level plots. So we'll see what that happens this year. And then once that trial is done, then we can do other things, like the gentleman said in the back, cover crops. Then we can maybe oversee those in the small plot and see what happens. Missy, give me the hook.
Unless we get any other questions. You guys are interested.
You want to comment?
We have one more question.
In the areas where you had the higher levels of P and K, did you see any more lodging in the wheat or any more IDC and white mold in the soybeans?
2021, the answer was no, dry. But in 2019, the first year, we did. And we did see a little bit, and I don't know the answer, but when we take tissue tests in soybeans, up in high pH soils that we have, more often than not, we have potassium deficient. The tests come back with K deficiency. Even though the soil test levels of K are high, there's some disconnect between what the plant gets and what the soil test is. I don't have the answer to that. That's just an observation that we have.
Just quick commenting on that with the potassium. Dave Franzen and also Dan Kaiser they're researching potassium availability as it relates to clay mineralogy too. They've been doing some research about different clay types tying up potassium, maybe causing some of those differences. Quick question before we get into some nitrogen stabilizer research. I got two questions for you. First off, as a general survey, which, source of nitrogen are you guys mostly using for general most of your crops? I kind of imagined we'd be pretty heavy on the urea, with still a few anhydrous folks out there. research, or this trial has been mostly focused on anhydrous ammonia. We did have one location where we tried to look at, or two locations where we tried to look at urea last year, but it just didn't work out to continue that this year. All right, so definitely a lot of urea users, some anhydrous users, but for everybody, how often do you use a nitrogen stabilizer with your nitrogen on any of your crops? Okay, so it looks like most folks aren't using nitrogen stabilizers. Some are, and hopefully those folks who are never using it are only applying after the soil temp is cooled off. Or in the spring. If it's fall application, hopefully it's only after the soil is cooled off. Alright. So this trial that we've been using, we mostly focused on the product Centuro. That Coke was kind enough to donate us Centuro. Just a reminder that Centuro is a nitrification inhibitor, so what it is doing is stopping ammonium from, so we apply anhydrous, and then the Centuro stops the ammonium from turning into nitrate. So it keeps the ammonium in the positive, the ammonium is positive, so it's the positive form, so it will stay put a little bit better than nitrate. Other products like urease inhibitors, which actually block the fertilizer from turning into ammonium. So those are different products. So what we did for this trial, we've been doing it, did it in 2019, 2020, and 2021. So this year we're looking at just the producer's rate of anhydrous, and then also so the treatment would be the anhydrous with Centuro applied at 5 gallons per ton. And so both these sites this year were fall applied. In past years, we have looked at both fall applied and spring applied anhydrous, just because the folks doing the trial couldn't get it on in the fall, so we applied it in the spring. And then so what we did, data we collected in season was looking at nitrate and ammonia kind of at 0 to 4 weeks after wheat planting in the spring, since that was about the time that we were able to get back into the field anyway, to get some soil sampling done. And we had to kind of rig up a custom soil sampler for this project that to sample across the entire anhydrous band. Using a normal soil probe with just the small soil cores, it'd be kind of hit or miss if you're hitting that anhydrous band. So we went with this route to try and attempt to get a better sample across that band. So with this method though, we're limited to just looking at the top 0 to 6 inches. So we had 2 sites, one in Argyle and one in Dorothy this year. Both were applied in the fall of 2021. You guys can see the field information, and I have the nitrogen results in a table in your book. You can follow along. The page numbers are on the bottom of the slide there. You can totally follow along in the book. Basically, we didn't see, so we're testing the differences with just the nitrogen, or just the nitrate, or just the ammonium within each sampling date. So that's what those significant differences are the type of nitrogen within each sampling date. And ideally with the Centuro, what we would want to see is a greater proportion of ammonia, or a greater proportion of the nitrogen staying in the ammonium form over longer compared to the control. But with the results this year is kind of a wash. The Argyle site, so way back, I believe it was in May, I think I wrote it down in the book. The Argyle site was part of that one random storm that dumped almost 8 inches all at once on a small area. So this field actually was in the middle of that storm, so it did have one rain event that got over 8 inches right in May. That was after our final soil sampling date, so we didn't get to see if that had any effect on the soil testing. But if there was any nitrification loss or denitrification losses from that rain event, it did show up in our yield. The Dorothy site was kind of the flip side. That was part of that band that just got smoked. Got very little rain there, and so most of that data is just all due to moisture effect. So I put it in the books, but that location is pretty much a wash. So that's kind of what I have for this year. Kind of over the last couple years looking at this Centuro research, we haven't seen a lot of differences in yield or the soil testing. I don't know if we really had any fields or if any of our tested locations have had major events or major opportunities for losses through either volatilization or leaching. So I think, but generally, university recommends that you apply if you're applying nitrogen, it's potentially going to be susceptible to losses. It's kind of an insurance policy, just in case you do get a major range event that washes all your nitrogen away or out of the rooting zone. But yeah, generally, if you're making fall applied applications, usually you're pretty safe so long as you're waiting until the soil is cold enough. So, looking at green seeding soybeans into a living rye cover crop. Question for you guys. So in this room, usually the Everyways dirt conference, dirt workshop is going, so usually there's a lot of cover croppers down there in Fargo today. I don't think she's having her conference today, so maybe we've got a few more cover crop users here. But have you considered using a cover crop in one of your fields? And if you have, or if you've thought about it, what would be your goal for that cover crop? You can just type your answer in. And if it's not something you thought about or want to do, you can write no. You can just type in no too. When I was putting my PowerPoint together, I got a few pictures of blowing dirt from this spring, and I forgot to stick it in the PowerPoint. But it seems like every spring we end up having a conversation, and Twitter explodes with all the pictures of soil blowing. So I think that's definitely one major thing we have up here, especially with sand, when we get in the sandier ground, sandblasting of soybeans. It's definitely an issue earlier this spring. Soil protection, soil erosion. So soil protection, I imagine crop protection is probably in there a little bit also. Looks like that seems to be the major thing that we're focused on up here. For this trial, so we just had one location. This that went in last fall. So after wheat was harvested, the producer who's up in Roseau, he planted the rye. I think he chilled the field first, and then he planted his rye in September, and then basically just left it, and then came back in the spring and planted his soybeans over the top of it. And that was all that he did to that field. I found one more mistake in there, so in the tillage, I crossed it out up here. There was no vertical tillage pass. That was an accident from copy and paste from the 2020 data. So he just had the one chisel pass. And so we were able to get some growth, or fall growth, even. The soil it still had some soil moisture, so it got the rye growing. It's difficult to see. Just for folks, if you haven't tried rye before, planted rye, a lot of times it comes up red, so it's easy. You can kind of see there's a little red shoot coming up in the soil in the middle of that picture on the left there. And so it's easy to miss and not see when you're if you're trying rye. Just keep in mind that it actually comes up red when you're trying to find it out in the field. Then it'll green up as it gets a little bit bigger. So before, we didn't end up with a whole lot of biomass. You actually can't really see it, I suppose, from the power, or from the screens way back there. Not a lot of biomass in the fall. And also get a lot of volunteer wheat growing up with that rye in the fall. Let's slide to the next one. But in the spring, the rye still came back pretty good. Good picture there on the right of just how early that rye starts growing. So that picture on the right is new growth. That's not frozen tissue. That is new growth from March 25th, and it's covered in frost. So about when your lawn starts greening up underneath the snow, that rye is greening up also. And so the rye in the middle of the picture there, you can see that was taken 3 days after the soybeans are planted, right over the top of the rye there. So we had a few, it was early tillering stage, but that rye grows very quickly in the spring. So within about, I suppose about within about 2 weeks there, we went from early tillering to boot, going into heading stage. By the time that rye was terminated, I believe on June 1st, early June. And so that was a lot of dry matter in a short amount of time. I tried to just harvested biomass at the time of soybean planting, so that first picture, and then at prior termination. So there was about a rye biomass that was in those pictures, and I tried to kind of estimate it as what you might harvest or what you might bale from straw. So kind of get like 600 or 800 bales, or 600 or 800 pound bale of straw. That's about the equivalent of the biomass from if you were going to terminate at planting versus terminating with your first soybean herbicide pass a few weeks later. And so that growing rye, so in those few weeks that rye took up a lot of moisture, and it also took up a lot of nitrogen also. And so you guys have a table in your books, but I have a chart up here. Definitely significant differences in soil nitrogen with that rye treatment. So you can see that first point there is in the fall, so in October prior to frost, got no differences. The rye is still very, it's just getting going. Then come the time of soybean planting, we already can see that we've got less nitrogen in that rye treatment, and then by the time we get to termination, there's about 30 pounds less nitrogen in that rye treatment compared to the control. And in a drought, depending on the year, that may or may not be a good thing. It just depends on your situation. I think this year it was not helpful, but when we're thinking about major IDC years, if it's wet, if you have a lot of residual nitrogen, maybe it might be helpful if the rye is using up some of that nitrogen. So this is the soil moisture. So our soil moisture measurements, the meter that we used is kind of a portable handheld meter. It just only focuses on the top 2 inches. So we didn't see any differences here. Topsoil was pretty dry for the majority of the season, so that's actually not surprising. But I can say that I did get good pictures this year. But the rye did take up a lot of moisture and competed with the soybeans, and so the soybeans were stunted and were farther behind in the rye treatment compared to the regular control. Pretty sure that was just due to moisture competition. Here we have soil temperature. Soil temperature was taken about 4 inches below the surface. Here, I think we have significant differences here, but I think they're within a degree, so I wouldn't say this was an agronomically important difference in soil temperature. So basically, you could say there's no difference, not really a difference in soil temperature between the rye and the control. This temperature was measured in the soybean row. So in each treatment, I measured the temperature in the soybean row. Weed pressure, last season, we looked at, I shared some data from some other locations that had weed pressure, and the rye actually had decreased weed pressure. This year, this field didn't have quite as much weed pressure, and I wanted to just draw attention to that CV. So that CV, coefficient of variation, that shows up on some of the tables and the data you guys look at in other applications also. It's very important for that CV to be less than 10%. And so when it's up to 30, 100%, it just basically tells you there's too much variability and the data is not really accurate. And so we did, like I mentioned before, we did see some stunting of the crop and the stunting of the soybeans. Soybeans were also a little bit behind in growth stage with the rye cover crop. And this year, I also ended up with some yellow beans again. And this year, we actually ran into a potassium deficiency. So I recall Dave Franzen was discussing it earlier this summer, seeing it in other crops that because of the drought, some crops are running into potassium deficiency. Without the soil moisture, the beans just couldn't take the K up. And so we saw this in this trial. I saw potassium deficient beans in both treatments, but it was more pronounced in the rye cover crop because that rye was using up more moisture and it's kind of exacerbated deficiency. I'd seen something similar in our site, one of our sites last year in Warren. This wasn't potassium deficiency, but I think it was also due to moisture stress because this site also had a very thick stand of rye that was terminated late. And so I think the story from these two locations really emphasizes the importance of terminating early and keeping on top of that density of that rye stand. When you have a thick, dense stand of rye that's using up a lot of moisture, it's going to affect your soybeans. I kind of already mentioned we decreased yields. We ended up with a 6 bushel yield loss because we did not terminate that rye on time, so we didn't terminate it as soon as it should have been terminated. And again, so at Warren, we saw a similar thing last year with our cover crop data. But in Dorothy, if you look at the last year, soybean yields were low in Dorothy, but they didn't have a difference in yield. There was no difference in cover crop versus control. He had actually used a sulfur tillage pass over the rye, over the whole field prior to soybean planting, and it really knocked the rye stand back. So that stand of rye was very thin. It was still about boot heading when it came to termination timing, but it was a very thin stand of rye, so it didn't compete with the soybeans and didn't reduce the yield. So a question, what was the termination timing on soybeans? So we terminated, the growers terminated the rye with their regular first pass of soybean herbicides, so it ended up being about 3 weeks, give or take, after soybean planting, which kind of the main story from kind of the experiments that we've done is that is just too late. Maybe if you've got a really wet year, there's enough moisture to go around, it's maybe less of an impact, but in general, the soybeans definitely need to get terminated earlier, which has actually led us to some new research, a new research project that we've started with the University of Minnesota, looking at rye termination timing. So we established 2 sites by Crookston and Farmers Fields this fall, planting rye after wheat harvest. One site is kind of just regular management, maybe a little bit of reduced till, and the other site is actually also looking at strip till. Also, it has a strip till treatment in there. And so this upcoming spring, we're going to look at 3 different termination timings. We're going to spray out the rye 10 days before planting, within about a day of soybean planting and then 10 days after planting to make sure we get that rye terminated when it's smaller, just to kind of find a better sweet spot for when we need to be getting this rye terminated so that we don't reduce the yield. With that, that was kind of our research that we've been using on the cover crops, or that we've done as far as on-farm research with the cover crops. We're going to be hopefully getting more into some other cover crop research and reduced tillage research in the future. That's the direction we'd like to go in. And we're going to hear from the cover crop panel later, so you guys have lots of questions. I think you'll have some good folks to ask about using cover crops up here. But as far as these experiments go, do we have any quick questions? Okay, yep. So Gary was just commenting, so you guys all noticed our volunteer spring weight problem this year. So Gary was asking about the volunteer wheat, and if you didn't, or some people took it out with a couple tillage passes or sprayed it out. Some people let it grow up. And so Gary is wondering what's going to be the effect on your residual nitrogen if you're leaving that, next year if you left your spring wheat grow and get tall. Yeah, and a lot of it, some of it headed out if you didn't terminate it. Some of it headed out. So I think we've got a few sites that I think we'll be able to maybe estimate on that. So some of our rye cover crop sites that actually the spring wheat the volunteer wheat was not controlled. So if we come back next spring, we can measure residuals or compare the nitrate in those plots. And we also started one site with a grower who's trying to look at reduced tillage. So he did till the volunteer spring wheat down this fall, but next year he's going to look at just compare doing 2 passes versus 1 pass. So we got 1 pass done this fall, and so his treatment next year will be doing a 2nd pass compared to just the 1 pass as far as residue management goes. But yeah, that is a good question that I'm sure a lot of folks have. What is that volunteer spring wheat out there? What's it going to do for next year?
Basically, I soil sampled early, and then I soil sampled right after freeze up. And spring wheat that grew up and headed out took between 30 and 40, 45 units of nitrogen out of the soil.
So I sampled wheat stubble early, and then I sampled right at freeze up, and we lost between 30 and 40, 45 units of nitrogen out of the soil that was tied up in that green matter. And we were headed, we were 2.5 to 3 feet tall. That was nicer than my first crop. I'm sure a bunch of that will be available come this spring. It's already starting to break down.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you hear about at least one farmer had the spring wheat, that volunteer spring wheat, take about 30 pounds of nitrogen, which is kind of similar to what we saw with the rye cover crop from this year. That rye cover crop took up about 30 pounds of nitrogen into the tissue, and so the question will be, next year, how quickly does that nitrogen in the tissue become available? I think that's something that NDSU, I know they've been researching, just to try and see. We assume it'll be available next year, but when does it actually mineralize? I think that's a question that NDSU has been working on. We are going to need to get to break. We'll take Yep.
So this is really more of a comment, and this is based on some on-farm research done by Rick Clark, I believe he's down in Kansas, but it's regarding the nutrient sequestration of cereal rye, and a 12-inch tall cereal rye crop growing in the spring, according to his work, has sequestered 82 pounds of nitrogen, 15 pounds of P2O5, 32 pounds of 046O. Now, or if you want to look at it, 0060, 133 pounds. If you let that go to a 28-inch tall rye crop, the nitrate nitrogen goes to 134 units, the P2O5 to 30 units, the K2O to 169, and the 0060 281 pounds. Along with 10 pounds of sulfur, 12 pounds of magnesium, 31 pounds of calcium. And that is being released then throughout the year to that crop.
Gotcha. Thank you, Ryan, for looking that up quick. Good food for thought. So what we've been doing, so Minnesota Wheat, we've been working with NDSU, or I've been working with NDSU on some on-combine protein mapping for the past few years. Trying to investigate a little bit more about what influences protein content and causes that variability in protein content within a field. So protein content is basically influenced by everything. You start off with your genetics, your different varieties. You have different, usually end up with different yields, different protein capacities. Then the environment that you're growing that variety in, how much rain you get will affect your yield and affect your protein, and how much nitrogen and what kind of management and how much nitrogen you fertilize that wheat with, all has an effect on yield, and that all in turn affects protein. So that's a very complicated beast to try to assess. So trying to manage protein content becomes a little bit harder than even trying to manage yield. So things out of our control affecting protein content, obviously water. Can't control how much water you're going to get unless you're irrigating, which I'm guessing most of us aren't. You can't control your soil texture that you have to work with. Organic matter is also a big influence there. Maybe can't control it. And I think some of our panelists that might speak later, a little bit later, might argue that the organic matter might be within our control, more within our control than we tend to think it is. But things we can do kind of from season to season to manage our protein content. So just take a look at our varieties that we're using and how much nitrogen we're putting on to actually feed those plants for yield and protein. So you might have seen some of this picture before. So there's a lot of variability with protein, just like there's a lot of variability with yield. So that those protein patterns are usually following the same patterns as yield in the maps. And so how we've been making those maps, we've been working with a company from Australia who has on-combine protein analyzers. I think there's some different kinds on the market, but this company has the best tech support. They've been very helpful. They actually came here, or they come to the U.S. on occasion to go service all the growers who are using their machines. So they're very helpful. They have a sampling head that's attached to the clean grain elevator, so that that sampling head will sample the grain as it's going up into the hopper, and then it will measure the protein, and you'll get, basically you'll have protein map. You'll get to see a real-time protein map in the cab, just like you would maybe if you have a yield monitor set up. The resolution on these protein maps is going to be a little bit coarser than yield map, so your yield map is generally taking readings every 1 or 2 seconds, whereas this is taking it about every 7 seconds. So it's a little bit coarser resolution map, but it's still a map that we have to work with. The growers we've been working with are in Roseau and Thief River Falls. We've been working with the grower in Roseau since 2017. We got the second machine going in 2018. Usually a lot of loams, some sandy loams, clays, a lot of different soil types on these farms. Last 2 years we've included a little bit of water table monitoring in a few fields to kind of measure depth of water table. The depth of water table at a few points within a few selected fields to try and correlate to that to hopefully what the protein map looks like, to try and estimate kind of what water we might have as a proxy or estimate of what we might have for available water, and how that influences yield and protein content. This year we just kept washing the water table down and down and down and down. So hopefully we'll be replenishing that a little bit this next season. And we're looking at this to get some observations and then start asking and answering some questions. Which factors are most influential on protein variability within a field? Can we identify protein management zones? If we can identify the causes of that variability, if it's something that we can manage. Is it possible to predict protein content with imagery, or at least correlate protein content with imagery and yield maps? And so we've been continuing this project, working with these producers, trying to get multiple years of protein maps on fields as they're going through their rotations. We've now been working with them long enough. We're on kind of our second and third cycles through some of their fields to start building up that database of protein maps that we can use with the rest of their field data. We did flew a drone on some of the fields also. We also have satellite imagery available to correlate with these protein maps. And so this winter is going to be a major deep dive into spatial analysis, looking at all these different factors: soil type, soil texture, kind of with the other measurements, depth of water table, imagery, and yield and fertility, and how that all connects with the yield and protein. Some observations that we've seen, kind of putting numbers and pictures to what you guys kind of already expect or might see as you're in the combine. Topography having a major influence on protein content. Different soil types. The imagery here, we have the imagery kind of is showing up, the yield and protein patterns kind of showing up in the imagery. One thing we want to look at is zone stability. We've seen the protein zones kind of be in similar places, but not necessarily, I should say, the patterns kind of show up in the same places, but a high protein area one year might be a low protein area the other year. So it's kind of similar to how you might have some places in the fields that tend to change. It could be high one year, or could be low the next year, depending on what the water does for the season. But the area of the field still tends to be the same. It's just what it's doing that changes. So that's one thing we're looking into with these is identifying these protein zones and then assessing stability. So hopefully in the future we'll be able to show you guys maybe some nitrogen removal, or maybe calculate our nitrogen use efficiency with these maps, validating maybe some in-season protein predictions for folks who don't have protein analyzers. How well does in-season imagery, how good of a proxy is that for protein yield and protein content? And then hopefully being able to identify management zones and test those management zones as they relate to protein and nitrogen fertility. So I'm going to just hand it over to our next speaker, Dr. Paulo Flores, who's with NDSU and their agricultural bioengineering systems department. He's going to kind of continue on our kind of precision ag topic and talk about drones and what he's been doing with variable rate herbicide applications. While he's getting set up, before he comes up here, question for you guys in the audience: are you guys currently using variable rate technology on your farm? For any of your crops or any applications? Okay, it's good to see you. a good number of precision ag users in the audience. Still some folks here maybe haven't tried it yet, but hopefully are interested. Farmers, farmers, it's not the variable rate technology is not, it's just for fertilizer at it. Various seeding rates and row crops is also another very helpful application. There's been talk of variable rate cover crop seeding, a potential research project, if anybody ever wants to try that out. All right, so we've got quite a few people who are familiar with it. So for you folks that are using variable rate technology, you can type in your answers, kind of what applications are you using it for fertility, for seeding rates, anything else. You can also pop in which crops you're mainly focusing on. I think it tends to be usually more like beets, corn, and they're usually the popular ones for using variable rate applications. For a lot of beets and corn, which, I mean, makes sense, those are your money makers, so it's great. And really want to tend to those crops a little bit better. Like we mentioned, yeah, fertilizer, variable seeding rates, especially if you're on hilly, if you got a lot of variable soils. All right. A little bit of variable rate on wheat. All right. Thank you guys for your answers. It's all interesting to see what folks are doing in the valley.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me? All right. Thanks, Melissa. As Melissa said, my name is Paulo Flores. I'm an assistant professor in precision ag at NDSU. And this is something that I have been working on for the last 3-4 years since they started talking about the use of drones in agriculture and how we could map the weeds and use that to create a prescription map and have the sprayer going down the field in the spray. Up to this day, I have seen none of that happen pretty much. You see pieces and parts being published here and there. And today, I want to present to you a project that we have been working on where we implement in the field this whole thing from the imagery collection to the spraying with a commercial side sprayer. So, what is the motivation behind this project? So, if you look at corn, for example, usually we have around 3.5 million acres of corn planted in the state. Okay, and a common approach to deal with weeds is to do basically a pre-emergence application of herbicide and another application around before B6 to kind of take care of those weeds that skip the first application. And that second application costs around anywhere between $15 to $20 an acre between the chemical, the products, the labor, and application itself. So my thought here is, can we use imagery and starting with drone imagery to basically, instead of doing this blanket application, apply the herbicide only on those spots that we have the weeds. And from that, can we kind of create some savings for farmers not just financial savings, but we're looking at environment impacts of this as well. How much less chemicals we're going to be applying on the fields. And talking about the financial savings, if you could decrease the amount of herbicides that you're applying in 10% of this area, you're looking in savings around $5.2 to $7 million a year for corn growers in North Dakota. Okay? That's interesting. So I think during the copy and paste the presentation, all the animations are gone. So what makes this project different? And this is one of the things that I was talking about. When you go in the literature and you start looking at weed mapping and applications of drones for weed control, this is pretty much what we found. It's different applications, different machine learning models and things that can identify weeds. They can create this map of the distribution of the weeds, and they stop right there. So, as I mentioned, on this approach, what we're trying to do is going from the image collection to the field application of the herbicides. So, another thing that makes this our approach kind of unique is that a lot of people that work in this area, they're looking for the weeds. So, on our case, for me, it's much easier to identify one species than try to identify 5 or 6. So what we're doing is actually we're looking for the corn. And once we found the corn in front of the corn grows, we kind of pull that out, and what is left are whole weeds. Okay? And on top of that, corn is not just one species, but the corn is growing on a row. So can we use that row structure to help us to find the corn plants? Let's make our lives easier. And the other aspect that kind of makes this project unique, we're doing this on a relatively large acres, around 40 acres or so. Okay, and as I mentioned, we're going beyond the mapping. We're creating the map and we're feeding this map to the sprayer and have the sprayer going out in the field and doing this spray based on a prescription map that was generated. Sorry, all that information was gone. So the objective of this study was first use the UAS imagery, the drone imagery, to create this weed infestation map across the field. And once we have that map, can we convert that map into a prescription map that can be pushed to a sprayer and have the sprayer going down the field and do the spray. So a couple notes that I want to share about this approach is that we're trying to kind of reach out for that lower hanging fruit. For me, a weed is a weed and needs to be controlled. And I'm not trying to separate the species. I think I always tell my students and collaborators, let's start easy, and as we learn and we become proficient on doing this, we can add another layer of complexity. Maybe later on we can start looking at separating broadleaves and grasses regarding those weed species. In this approach, just to make clear, we're trying to do this on the post-emergence application. We're not trying to push this on that pre-emergence application. That's makes no sense to do this there. And we're trying to do here too, we're not trying to do per se variable rate application in each single nozzle. What we're trying to do is basically telling the spray, shut the nozzle off when you have no weeds. So this is either 15 gallons per acre or whatever the rate is, or 0. Okay? And as I mentioned, we're using some drones to collect the imagery. And the reason that we're using, we're looking at 2 of them right now, is that some of them are easier to fly, but with limited amount of acreage that you can cover for those. This one is a little harder to fly and to process the data, but the image quality is much, much better. And actually, I invest quite a bit of money on getting this rig set up, because flying high, my assumption is, okay, we can fly high, fly a little faster, we can cover more acres on the same battery. So what we ran into is that this camera, the image quality is so great that the camera has a harder time writing the image to the SD card fast enough where it would allow us to fly faster. So we actually have to slow the drone down to allow that time for the image to be written to the SD card and to end up with a good image quality. So when I talk about image quality, so this is 350 feet above ground, okay? And that's the kind of detail that you can see on the images that we're capturing. So you can clearly see the corn rows and the weeds here. If you zoom in up, for those that are familiar with some of these weeds, you might even be able to recognize what weeds are. This species of those weeds. So the trial that we're trying to do here, so we're using actually corn silage that it's actually pretty good for what we're trying to accomplish here. So we're using around 42 acres, and for the purpose of running some statistics and things like that, instead of running, doing the 42 acres, we have basically 2 treatments set up here. In green, we have the site-specific weed control. That's the approach that we're trying to implement. And in black here, we have the blank application. That's basically you turn the nozzles off and just drive over the plot. Okay? Each plot here is 400 feet long by 136.6 feet wide, which is the width of this spray. Okay? So how do we go about this? So we start with just with the single, the imager, the RGB imagers, and from that imager we use some segmentation where we can basically first step separate every crop or every piece of vegetation, doesn't matter if it's the corn or wheat or the corn or weeds, from the background, from the soil. So, and once we have that done, then now we go in and we're looking for the corn. And we figure out where those rows are. Once we have the rows, our current approach is we create a little buffer around the row where we can cover the corn plants, and we created this buffer and pull everything that's under the buffer. We delete all the vegetation under the buffer, and what we end up with is something like this. Now, this bluish, greenish color here, outside the buffer zones, are the weeds. Okay? And somebody can ask, say, what happened to the weeds between the row? Right? What happened to those weeds growing between the plants in the row? So the idea that I had for this original idea was to have cell size, and we'll talk about in just a little bit in Greek, that would cover four rows. And as you'll see a little bit later too, the whole idea is I'm not trying to spray the individual weeds, but I'm trying to spray a cell that provides a buffer. And now because the cell covers more than one row, so those weeds between the row, they would be sprayed as well. Okay? So there is the grid that we use actually this past year. And you will see here that the cell size that we used this past year was basically 1.6 feet by 10 feet long. 1.6 feet is the space between each nozzle, 20 inches. Okay, or 0.5 meters. And the reason that we did that is the corn this year had an unusual high infestation of weeds. What we're thinking is that they did the pre-emergence application, but they didn't get any rain on top of that. And that limited the efficiency of that application. So there was a lot of weeds. If you we tried to do the 10 by 10 feet here, and we would have to spray like 95 to 99% of the crop. So we used this 1.6 feet by 10 feet, and now we wouldn't have to spray 35% of the field. Okay? So, and this is basically the approach that we use. So if you're looking at each cell here, we're basically asking kind of this question. If there is one weed or more in a cell, the whole cell gets sprayed. If there is no weed on the cell, there is no reason to spray that cell. Okay? And that, as we do that across the whole field, we end up with something like this, where this pinkish color here, where we should apply 15 gallons per acre herbicide, and the green color here where the cells that didn't have any weeds, so we are applying 0 gallons per acre. Okay? So at this point, we're doing all of this into ArcGIS software. So the next step is just convert this to a format where a sprayer can read. And we use AgSMS to do that. Just pass the file to AgSMS, export it as a file for the cabin computer that you have in the sprayer. Or in case we had a Viper 4 Plus, and you can see here the two rates, basically 0 and 15 gallons per acre. Okay? It looks pretty straightforward, but there's some challenges that we have faced with this system, and one of them it's the cost of implementing some of these. It depends how you see it, and so we're talking about to get this individual nozzle control that is necessary for this kind of application. You have to have a CAD computer that can handle that, and you have to have a couple of logs. And this is what I kind of don't understand. So when you're paying $500,000 for a sprayer, they have this $8,000 on log fees. If the hardware is all installed, that why don't you put this price on the base price of the sprayer? So, but no, they will charge you an extra, I think, between the two, $13,000 for those two unlock fees. So at the end, you're looking, from a base price sprayer for a sprayer that can do this, we're looking investment, I think, around 46 grand. Okay? That's the first one. The second one, and it doesn't show very well here, but basically, and people don't think much about this, is the GPS receiver refresh rate on your sprayer. Okay? Basically, a lot of the receivers up there, they have a 10 hertz refresh rate, meaning that they can update the position 10 times a second. Okay? And what that does is that it limits the speed that you can go when you're trying to apply this in a very fine space. So the KZH engineer's recommendation was that we keep that the space that the GPS can refresh its rate either at 1 feet or more. Okay, so if you do some calculations, we get down here that the maximum speed that we can use to do something like this is around 7 miles per hour. Now, if you have a sprayer that has a higher refresh rate, maybe we can do this a little faster. Okay? So that's the limitation too. I'm pretty sure this is not going to play. So this is basically a very heavy video showing the implementation of all of this in the field. Okay? You have, you can't see the details here, but you have the prescription map here, and the sprayer is going down the field and just spraying the weeds based on that. It looks pretty nice. This is the as-applied map that we get afterwards, and you can see that there are 6 plots right there. It looks like the sprayer did a good job. If you plot right on top of that the prescription map, it's hard to see, but if you zoom in on that plot there, you can see that the sprayer actually did a pretty decent job spraying those cells where it was supposed to spray. The only problem that we have with this is that when we pass that prescription map from ArchiGIS through AgSMS, AgSMS has some settings where it changes the minimum size of the cells or zones that to make life easier or on the controllers for variable rate application. And what they did, they messed up all our map. So, and of course, you don't realize this until after the fact, right? And this is the kind of thing that we have one shot. Remember, this is a few, and you have one shot to do this, okay? So, this here, on the same plot, this is my map, my prescription map that I create in ArchiGIS, okay? On the bottom here is the same map, and now I just placed the as-applied map, the zero rate cells that I want to spray. It's supposed to be the green here, okay? So you see what happens here? It's very different. And that kind of throws us off when we were trying to analyze some of this data. Because one of the big questions for me when doing this is, okay, what happened in the fall on these cells that were not sprayed in the sun? Do they have more weeds than the others that were sprayed? Because if they have more weeds than the others, that doesn't make any sense to do this. Because that will just increase the seed bank of weeds on your fields. So when we're trying to do that, we're looking to answer that question, because some of those cells that were supposed to be not to be sprayed, they were sprayed, and vice versa. So it becomes very complicated. I have a graduate student, this is his master's project, and he is kind of digging to the data as we're speaking, to try to figure out what happened to those cells that were not sprayed. Do they have kind of similar amount of weeds than the ones that were sprayed? If that's true, so we're good. But we believe that we're going to have some issues here this year, especially this year, because one of the things that we have is a small size cell, so that 1.6 foot by 10 foot cell I think is small. So you think about the space between row is 30 inches, and the space between the nozzles is 20 inches. So if you turn a nozzle off that's kind of going right between the row, you're going to end up probably skip some weeds that are growing in the row. And that too causes the, kind of some under application, because you don't have now the overlap of the neighboring nozzles. So we're thinking that this year we're going to end up with more weeds on that treatment of site-specific weed management or control than the other one. The other reasons that we're looking into is it's possible that we miss very small weeds during the image analysis. So it is a possibility. We try all that we check. We zoom in and out on the imagery, and we kind of caught most of it, but it is possible. And the other thing too is that maybe we waited too long to spray, and those weeds are too big for the rate or the dosage that was applied. So those are some of the things that we're considering as well. And looking for the future, next year we got some funding to continue this project. Next year we're looking for identifying a hardware combination of drone camera that would allow us to fly this a little faster. It takes me like around an hour to cover this, end up being 50, 60 acres to collect the imagery, which is not too bad, but try to do that in 1,000 acres. So you're going to be there for a while. The other thing that we're trying to do is improve the algorithm to find the rows. And that will allow us kind of better separate the corn from the weeds. So, because when you created a buffer, there are some plants, corn, that are just too big. We end up identifying the tip of the leaves as a weed because the tip of the leaf kind of stays outside of the buffer. There are some few points where you can see that as well. Automate the whole thing. Can we create a system that will automate from the row detection part of it to the part that we can spit it out to this RX map? And the economics of this. We brought in somebody from the agribusiness department to look at some of the economics of this. You can think about driving at 6.5 miles an hour to spraying doesn't make a lot of sense, because what speed do you guys usually do spraying? 12 miles an hour or something like that? But taking consideration that if you're saving 40-50% on this, and not spraying that much, now you're refilling less often. We're using less water. You're spending less time going back to refill. So how all that plays out on this. So that's what we're trying to look at. And another thing that we have a side project and look into this is how the cell size, both forward and sideways, affect the accuracy of the sprayer. Meaning how and how the speed plays on all of this, especially moving forward. If you have a small size cell, like say 5 feet long, is the sprayer going to be able to accurately spray in the area where this cell has to be 20 feet long? So I would love to do that with other machines other than the KZ, and then now actually would be a perfect time to do a dye over snow. We try to do this over crops and from using a red dye, and we cannot see anything in the dye. Yeah. So thank you for the opportunity, and thanks for your time today, and I will try to answer any questions that you might have. Yes. Yes, we do have RTK actors on both on the drone and on the sprayer. We have some ground control points on the field, and we're between 2 to 4 centimeters accuracy, so something like this. So this is the setup that we have. It's actually a PPK system. So we have this base station in the field, which we put down at least 2 hours before we start flying. And we have this device here that actually triggers the camera and saves latitude and longitude and a bunch of other information. And what we do, we can pull the data from this device and use the data from this station, and correcting this data, we can achieve around the 2 centimeters accuracy. Because we have to do this because the nearest core station to the site is like 70 kilometers. So we get really bad accuracies just using that. That's a good question. The question was, they were looking to this to do the same on soybeans, wheat, and things like that. And that goes with what I said earlier, with that lower hanging fruit. We're starting for corn because it has wider space. But I can see that it could be applied to soybeans. It would be really tricky on wheat and small grains. So, because they are just too narrow, unless you have some other filter that you can separate the weeds from it.
This technology, could you implement, some kind of kinetic free energy that you'd use to have wireless electricity? So you could use like an application for harvesting, like let's say apples or elderberries or other crops and stuff like that. Is the technology? Is there enough computer science for that?
I think that's a very different technology. What we're talking about here. For what you're talking about is much more, having a camera system and a computer vision system that can do that real-time recognition of what that apple is or whatever we're talking about. But that's a much more complex operation. That's where probably machine learning and those kind of things come to play much more. I don't think an approach like this would work for that. It's just a very different subject matter.
Are you going to be able to calculate the amount of chemical to use on a particular field?
Yeah, we can calculate that from the as applied map, because we have what we can measure what this gray area here is, and on the file that we download from the sprayer, we can just add the amounts up and come up to that number. Yeah. It's fairly easy to do.
And the same would go for the prescription map too, if you wanted to figure out how many acres you need to spray.
Right, and that's the other thing that this kind of makes approach like this, like you know ahead of the time how much herbicide you really need for apply over your field. Because for using that prescription map, you can calculate the acres times the rate.
Is there a way to put the technology that's on the drone onto the sprayer and do this all in real time? Similar to what a green seeker technology is?
So what that technology is very similar. What this does different from the technology, like the green seeker, like the see and spray technology that John Deere just came up with, is that they cannot separate crop from weed. Because they are looking just green pixel. And a green pixel is a green pixel for them. They cannot tell that a green pixel from a weed is different from a green pixel from a plant. So it would spray the whole thing. I can see in the future they improving the technology to do that. But at this point, I don't think that you could do that yet. So you will take a tremendous computer power to process this as you're going down. And the other thing is, too, can the sprayer do that? You know, you can put a computer in a sprayer, but can the sprayer react fast enough? The turnaround time on this, from the imagery collection to the creating the map, I think we can do it 12, 15 hours. So we could probably do it for the next day. And that's where one of the goals is to automate some of that. Because we can run this overnight. And there is no need for somebody to be there clicking the screen to do the next step and stuff like that. Would this work on spray section control only? The tricky part there is that the sections are not the same size. My understanding is that they have a different number of nozzles.
It can be. My sprayer is there set up in 20-foot section.
Because if you talk, my first idea of this is to be a 10 by 10 feet by 10 feet. And that means you'll be controlling 6 nozzles at a time. Now, can you do that across the boom? I don't know. If you could, now, yeah, probably would work. I don't know if it depends on the cab computer that you have, if the cab computer would be able to handle the map. This is a great question. And I was taught about that, and I was told by Case IH that the problem is that the nozzles are not the same. The number of nozzles in each section is not the same.
So I think now we are going to switch to our cover crop panel. We have a few growers from the area, so I think if they could come up. You guys remember, if you guys were here 2 years back, we did a cover crop panel. So it's Brian, we have Brian Pugh from Barnesville, Minnesota. Who's been using cover crops for quite a while. Or actually, I'll let you describe too. We also have Tim Dufo here from Gently, Minnesota, who's just been kind of learning about cover crops and reduced tillage these last few years. So he's kind of in the new kid on the block learning stage. And then hopefully, we also have Michael Larson coming, if you guys know who he is. So he's hoping he can be here in about 10 to 15 minutes, and he's ran into some problems, so he'll slide up here too. And he's from Drayton, Minnesota, and has been doing a lot of work with cover crops and soil health over the past few years. So I think with that, I think I'll just give you guys a few minutes just to talk about your farm and some of the things, describe folks, your farm, kind of the crops, soils that you're working with, and some of the things that you've been trying over the last few years. If you describe, I think we've got kind of maybe a cover crop novice audience here today. So you can kind of maybe also describe kind of how you got started, why you got started, how you got started, and some of those learning curves that you ran into as well. So I think maybe, Tim, I don't know if you want to go first, just to tell everybody about your farm and kind of what you've experienced so far.
Okay, yeah, I'll kick it off. So, Tim Newful, farm in Gently area, which is between Crooks and Red Lake Falls, kind of on the beach ridge of the Old Lake Agassiz, so the soils are from moderately heavy, it's not exactly red river heavy clay, but heavy-ish towards low sand. We do have rocks, I have a rock picker, so I'll tell you a little bit about my soils. I'm a newbie when it comes to cover crops and soil health. How I got into it, just watching what other guys are doing. David Miller over here. I mean, you start watching it, you realize this stuff can work. But how do I get it on my farm? And where do I start? You don't just jump in with both feet. Some people do and make it work. A little bit more cautious. Started out, I bought I wasn't conventional. Our crops right now were half wheat, half soybeans, have had dry beans, sunflowers, everything else in the mix over the years, but that's where we're at now. I was just a conventional farmer, chisel plow, cultivated in the spring, and black was better than anything. But after going to some soil health things, some soil health days like at David's farm, you just start realizing that there's maybe a better way. And so a few years ago, I bought a sulfur vertical tillage tool, and it started instead of chisel plowing, just was using that in the fall to size the crop and leave the residue on the top. Even did a project with the On-Farm Research Network for 3 years, where we had a quarter section and we split it up between conventional tillage and vertical tillage, and over 3 different years, basically found out there was no difference in yield, very negligible difference. So kind of told me that I wasn't losing any money or losing any yield with vertical tillage. I was saving money because I was doing less passes. So I transitioned to where basically that's the only tool we use. In the last couple of years, tried to cut down on even using that to just going more no-till. As far as cover crop, a couple of years ago, I took the first plunge, seeded a field with rye, had the co-op just spread it with their fertilizer spreader, worked it in with the vertical tillage. Did well, didn't do any testing on it, so I didn't know what the yield was. And so then over the summer, visiting with Melissa, and that's what happens when you visit with Melissa. She got an experiment on my farm, so she talked earlier about the timing experiment that she's doing with the University of Minnesota Extension, and that I'm one of the guinea pigs there. So this fall we seeded 12 strips, or the 3 replications of rye into my wheat stubble that's going to be soybeans next year. And so come next spring, we'll terminate it at 3 different times to try and see what's the best timing. So that's basically my story. Again, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm doing it, so we'll just see a little bit at a time how it goes.
Ryan Haug, Barnesville, Minnesota, farm and ranch there with my brother Michael. Been doing no-till cover crops, the whole soil health
road we've been traveling down since about 2014. And unlike Tim here, I jumped in well over my head. I didn't put my big toe in, I tied a rope to my brother, I jumped in and drug him in with me. So kind of drank the Kool-Aid and took after it. So and we've been real happy with our results. We raised corn, soybeans, barley, wheat, alfalfa, and then we run a cow-calf operation and a heifer development program as well. So a lot of our cover crops are focused on creating forage for the livestock to graze in the fall and winter, as well as the soil health benefits from it. And like I said, she'd asked me to send some pictures, so I went through my phone quick, and I'm terrible at taking pictures, but this is some cover crop that was flown on into standing corn Labor Day weekend. I believe this was in 2015, and radishes, turnips, barley, and I believe there's some clover in there as well.
So Ryan, you guys do a lot of cover crops in the fall. How, I guess, in your experience from year to year, how successful are your fall established cover crops?
Highly variable.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was,
So
I was wondering.
when we flew on the corn, as we get to that, is that the first year it was great. We got a tremendous stand, everything took, and the next year we did it hardly anything, maybe 20%. But when we flew it on the first year, we caught rain the next day. The next year we didn't catch rain for a week or two, I think, and it just kind of never wanted anything. Now we've only flown it on twice because the guy that we were hiring just said he's too busy spraying sugar beet fungicide at that same time, and he just said he wouldn't do it anymore.
So do you use a lot of multi-species mixes in your cover crops now, or does it just kind of depend on the field, or what you're intending
It
for?
depends on the field and what our intentions are with it. We try to get at least 4 or 5 species in on everything. We do have some fields where we'll only plant cereal rye if it's a late fall and we can't get in. It seems like if we can't get it planted before September 1st, then we start pulling a lot of the stuff out of the mixes. If we can get in that first to second week of August, if we have an early small grain harvest, then we can kind of throw the book at it and give it everything. Pretty much everything will take then. But as we get into September, cereal rye, kale, radishes are about the only thing that'll really amount to anything at that point. So we don't till anything, but we do soil sample every year in the fall after harvest. And I do not have any of that data compiled as far as how, what's our percentage increase of organic matter, that kind of thing. When we did all this, when we went to the no-till soil health cover crops, we also went to variable rate fertility for all our NP and K, and then we started with a different company that we work with now, Castleton, North Dakota, Veris. He does all of our prescriptions, and so in our fertility recommendations, we switched a lot of things kind of in a 2-year time, so I can't speak to what the difference would have been if we had stuck with what we had or not changed anything. Yeah, definitely the grazing restrictions is one of the biggest things with the herbicides for us, because we do try to graze as much as we can, and then also the rotation restrictions. If it's a sugar beet friendly rotation for herbicides, it seems like it's a cover crop friendly rotation, so that's kind of what we've had to shift things towards.
I'm Michael Larson from Drayton, that's an hour north of here, where no-till can't be done, and we are just about not tilling anything. We'll till to incorporate lime, we'll till after sugar beets to level rows, and that's just about the extent of it. This year the primary thing we were looking at was adding animals into our rotation, into our mix. So we brought some cows this spring and put in a multi-species cover crop on probably a quarter and grazed another 80 of cereal rye before that. So we can see what animal impact is going to do. I think if you're already doing that, you're way ahead of the curve. But I look for really good things out of that. As far as sugar beets, we've been no-till sugar beets, 100% no-till for at least 2 years, maybe 3. did some experiments before that with no-till and green seeding the cereal rye. I would caution the cereal rye a little bit. It's not quite as friendly as soybeans, it's not as forgiving. A friend by Drayton is doing off-row, he's planting cereal rye in 22-inch rows, and he can plant the beets 11 inches off. I think that looks like an awesome idea for beets. Other than that, we green seed most of our soybeans. Most of our acres get cover crops every year. Very few crops are ever seeded as a monoculture on purpose. Our corn is all 44-inch now, and we seed that. Before this year, we've used a spreader to put it on, and just like you were saying, the results are very varied. First year we had great luck, so this is easy. That was probably the 22-inch rows back then. And next year, got straightened out quickly that if the rain doesn't come on the right day, a spreader is not a good enough way to do it. This year we rented a tool to interseed. I think that was a very nice idea in a dry year. I don't think we would have got anything up otherwise. But the corn grew too fast, so not 100% of it got seeded. We were going to go out and graze some of that, but winter came on pretty quickly, and I didn't have my water in place yet. So the arrangement I had with the party that brought his cows over to run with ours was that he'd take them for the winter. So we sent them back when it got cold, but hopefully next year we'll have a water system in place and run that a lot later.
Quite a variation of what you guys have going on your different farms. To continue on with some of the audience questions, feel free, we can get you guys mics too if you want to if you have more questions about the different things that they have going on.
How do you feel about people coming onto your operation and walking through how you do everything? Are you open to doing like crop tours and stuff on what you've got going on and how as you're doing the cover crops, what's working and what's not? You don't always do like these guys are doing trials and stuff. Well, it seems like you're doing trials too, but what works on one person's farm, what works on another person's farm, why do you they have the same soil every year? So going around and kind of figuring out, what works in some places and what works in other places, it's going to be kind of nice to just to see the person in their lives.
Is that directed at me? Or, okay. As far as us, we absolutely let people out anytime they call ahead or tell me they want to come and see something. We've had visitors from as far off as Australia looking at our cover crops. We hold a field day most years, not all, just depends on the season. Last year I didn't feel like doing anything, so we didn't do it. But this year we had a field day. Interesting thing about that is one of our initial reasons to get into reduced tillage and thinking the soil aggregation is important was infiltration. Infiltration on our farm, the first time we tested 3 fields with Dr. Wick and her assistant and my daughters. In those 3 fields, if you are familiar with an infiltration test, you put the equivalent of an inch of water into a ring, wait till it goes down to nothing, and in that time period, that's how long it will take to infiltrate 1 inch of rain. 2 of our 3 fields did not infiltrate. We pulled them out because it was half an hour and they weren't even close. I've got a picture of Luke holding the can up, and there's water on the top and the soil's dry on the bottom. That's 3 inches in the soil. And 3 inches of dry soil, our water couldn't get down in 30 minutes before. Now this summer at our field day, we did an infiltration test in sugar beets and we did an infiltration test in an oat field. I was with on the oat field, and I think we got probably the first inch in 20 minutes or something. It wasn't spectacularly fast, but it was a vast improvement from what we've had before. The sugar beet field, which is a no-till sugar beet field, which had been oats the year before, I think the first inch went through in less than 10 seconds or something. It was just wild, and they did a second inch also. We've never done a second inch on our farm anywhere. Now, was it the drought? I don't know. That it was dry that time of year, so there's no question that's a difference. Most years we're wet, and if we're wet, how's it going to infiltrate? But that's still, I can still tell you that's a big improvement in our heavy clay soils.
stop by. I don't just pull in the driveway, there might not be somebody there. They want to call ahead. In 2019, we also hosted a field day. And I think we had like 50-some people there. The day we were there. But absolutely, anytime, we're an open book on asking questions and answering. I'm a pretty strong believer in the fact that your neighbor probably won't tell you anything, but I'll tell you anything as long as you're 50 or 60 miles away from me. That's the way it goes. Everything's so proprietary in this industry, it seems.
For me, nobody's come, I haven't had a field day or anything, I've talked to the neighbors or whatnot, but that's about it.
The center guy there, I think he had a picture up there with soybeans with interseeded of a cover crop. Any issues with the green matter when you're trying to take the beans off as far as your combine or a test sample or anything like that in the grain or staining of the seed?
Yeah, we actually did get some staining of the seed, so I would definitely not recommend doing that on seed bean production acres. We raised seed beans for Pioneer. We did not do it on those acres, thankfully, because it would have been rejected. The elevator guy, I wasn't hauling when my brother was trucking, and he said that the guy dumping out the back looked at him a couple times, but nobody said anything. But yeah, they did get some green staining on them. Didn't have any issues with the cutter bar cutting them or anything like that, or having extra moisture or something like that. So.
And then also for your fall grazing, for people who have cattle, how many weeks of fall grazing were you able to get on the average? Some years it's going to change or be different depending on the stand or the growth of it, but how much does that save you, like a month's worth of feeding or something like that, or grazing all winter long? Because I know people that have cattle and they graze corn all winter long. The cows, they'll see the 80 of corn, and those cows will be out there in that cornfield eating all winter long, and in the spring there's nothing left of it.
Yeah, so the fall grazing very variable as well. This year's the earliest we've had feed since 2015. And in 2015 we went to end of January. 2016 we grazed until March 26th. In 2017 it was first week of February or something like that. 2016 we started feeding in December. So we fed the month of December. We had some other things that came up with that. And then we turned the cattle back out in January and then grazed until March 26th. And we could have gone for another week or so, but we were going to start calving the 1st of April. Had one calf show up on the 25th, and we said, no, they're too far away from home to start calving. So we brought them home. Today, I would say we would leave them out there calf all on that quarter because it was high and dry and all that. But Christmas Day a couple years ago was the first day we fed. But we grazed corn as well, standing corn. We've done corn where we've interseeded annual ryegrass and soybeans on 44-inch corn and 66-inch corn. We'll typically try to come off of our cool season pastures in October, go on to a cover crop. This picture is a barley cover crop, barley, radish, and turnips, clover after a barley harvest. This would have been taken about the first week of October. We'd graze this typically into November, and then sometime in November we would go to our full season cover crops, and then usually make that last into December, and then from December on, then we typically graze standing corn. So just trying to develop that forage chain has been our ticket. Now this year, with as dry as it was, we had to go on to our full season cover crop a little earlier in the end of September, and then come back on to our cover crops after the wheat and barley came off then in end of October, and then we are feeding now. We started feeding everybody about 2 weeks ago.
Is there any concern or have any issues, or do you delay seeding for like fly breeding or Hessian fly, different things like that, or do you try to seed as soon as you can, or how?
Yeah, we try to seed as soon as we can after the combine goes across the field. Now that's not always as soon as I'd like it to be. It comes down to a manpower issue. typically within a week, we try to get it after harvest. One day in the fall is like 3 or 4 days in the spring as far as growth. I mean, the longer you wait, the less biomass you will create.
And if you have any moisture issues, the day after the combine or the day of the combine, there's a lot more moisture than 7 days later. Emergence will be way better.
How are you handling fertility in planting corn or beans? Is it all through the planter, or are you side dressing?
So we've been spreading a lot on top because typically we get a lot of rain. And if you have covered soil, there's not much runoff. So we think that's been an option. This spring was dry. We changed to a lot of liquid. We've done some different things because of that. We're in a place right now, if I took the time, we could do 100% liquid on corn.
Most of our fertility is put down with our air drill. We're on a 3-tank, 19-tank cart. I out-drive variable rates. We variable rate all of our and B&K separately by zone. Each of our fields has 5 zones. P&K zones are different than the N zones, all based on yield goal, organic matter, slope, and there's just a ton of variability, variables that go underneath in those maps, and we keep tweaking them every year. I don't know if we'll ever have them where we want them. And maybe they were there already 2 years ago, and we screwed it up again, who knows. But it's kind of a moving target with that. And then with our corn planter, we do liquid in furrow, and then all of our nitrogen with urea, pre-plant, and then come back with a side dress of 60 units of 28% in season with wide drops on corn.
And for me, soybeans, it all goes down with the seed. Wheat with the urea, that's where I'm having questions. I might have to switch to anhydrous just to get it covered if I don't want to work the soil as much. So the last few years I've been applying the urea as late in the fall as possible, or if there's rain in the forecast, and I can get it done with the co-op and get it spread ahead of that, so that'll work it into the ground. On the drier times, I'll just have to go out with the sulfur and do as best I can there. But that's a question going forward, is how do I get the nitrogen in the ground without disturbing the soil as much as I can.
In 2021, we ran our 1890 in front of everything also. So all of our beets, all of our corn, all of our cereals had two passes, like one with the 1890 for pre-banding and one for seeding. Takes a lot of time to get behind that.
With the no-till or limited till, have you seen an increase in disease in your sugar beets, or not really?
No difference that I can tell so far. As we get more multi-species involved, I would think it would decrease.
So I think the question was kind of for the on-farm network, what tools do we have at our disposal to kind of help you guys assess what cover crops are going on? And as the on-farm network, we have, we're limited on our resources, but that's why we use folks at universities like NDSU and U of M. So I think Lindsay Pease is actually in the back
yes,
there.
Angie handed me the microphone here. Yeah, what kind of things do we use to analyze all the data? We have, yes, kind of does make you feel like a mad scientist sometimes. Beakers and instruments, what things we can measure, nitrates, really easy to measure, total nitrogen, and the same sort of tests that you would do for the soil, we can do for water and soil, usually on the same instrument and for plants. And boy, we've been doing some greenhouse gas testing, which would be like the emissions side of it. You can do air quality with that same equipment. And we're starting to branch out more into the carbon side of the measurements too, because that's obviously a hot topic right now. And looking at, soil microbial activity, there's all those things that we can look at.
Mm-hmm. And basically, if we can get a soil test, anything that AgVise offers, we can grab a soil test and send to AgVise or order a different soil testing lab for analysis.
You have a program set up to go out to farmers, and use sampling and all that kind of stuff?
Yep, so how it works is if you guys have any experiments or things you want to try, it doesn't even have to be a replicated strict trial. If we just want to test something out, as far as cover crops go, if we just want to do a demonstration or a side-by-side or something like that, you can give us a call and we can work something out, figure out some logistics of what you want to do, and maybe look at kind of things that you want to test, so maybe soil-wise, see if it's something that we can test on farm-wise. That's something that you would get a hold of Minnesota Beets or me to help kind of do more, to help you get a deeper look at what's going on in the field.
Well, you go fishing for about a week while others are out on the farm for delayed planting, or are you in the field pretty much when everybody else is?
This picture is me planting into cereal rye, and we got 1.25 inches or so of rain about 5, 6 o'clock the evening before, and this picture is at 9 o'clock the next morning. Our neighbors didn't get back in the field for another day after that. As far as, do we good to go fishing? I don't really get to do much fishing, I guess. I wish I could, but with the cattle around, that's kind of impossible. Some years we're in a day or two ahead of our neighbors, and some years we're a day or two late. The years that we're a day or two late, oftentimes is not because the fields weren't fit, it's because we weren't ready. There was cattle things going on. Anytime we've got free time, that's consumed by those cows.
I'd say very, very similar on our farm. If we're not in the field as soon as the neighbors, it's within a couple days or I just wasn't ready. And like he's saying here, we don't stop when the first few drops come. If there's 500s of rain or something, it'll shut down all the conventional till guys. We'll keep rolling with clean wheels.
I've got a follow-up question, Michael Larson, for you on this. You're in the floodplain. You know that more years than not you're going to get flooded there. So, what's your plan with all the biomass? It intrigues me when you say, "Hey, I can get in the field," but how do you think that's going to affect it? The last couple of springs we haven't had that situation.
Color makes a lot of difference. If you have yellow straw on top, and if there's a mat that's thick, you're going to stay damp for a while. If you have green, it warms up quicker. The rye, in this example, is using moisture as we speak, and it's creating a pad for your tractor to run on. So I'm not one that's scared of green. I am concerned where I don't get cover crops planted. Worst case scenario, we've had to go get the neighbor's Summers Coulter machine or something like that. 2 years ago, planting beets, we had to run a Coulter machine because we got the beet planter stuck, which is unheard of on my farm. The beet planter is getting stuck, someone's in their own field. But it happened. We ran that Coulter, I think we got stuck again. So there's definitely problems, but it's no different. It's a different set of challenges. It's not necessarily more or less. So early in the spring, I would not be using glyphosate, depending on what we're terminating in front of, because I want to change my mode of action. If there's nothing up, I'm going to use Parazone or something similar. If we're in season on soybeans, if we have moisture, I don't really care how tall that rye gets. If I come in with a sprayer and I can see my soybeans at that angle, I'll usually turn around. Now, last year, that was a mistake, but I don't know if anything was right last year because we just didn't have rain when we needed to. But if we have good moisture, I've had rye up to the door of my pickup before we terminated, so that the heads have even been there and we've gotten a little bit of grain in the combine. And we've had very similar crop to the neighbors. Now, the reason for doing that would be the excess roots in the ground and feeding biology. It will not be because you're going to harvest the rye or anything else, in my option. But you can certainly kill it earlier, but we've got no problem. Rye goes down like nothing. You could probably use, if rye was all you were doing, 22 ounces would probably be fine. Really in the spring, I wouldn't worry about that at all. If it's just rye. If you have other weeds, then you get them pre-emerge, so you can use something like Paragon.
This picture that's up here now was soybeans planted into cereal rye. The cereal rye was no-tilled as part of the cover crop after barley harvest. And when we planted the beans, it was the rye was in the boot stage. It rained that night, and we got busy doing other things. I didn't get back to spraying this field. The beans were coming out of the ground when I sprayed it, and I sprayed that. So then the rye was heading then at that point, and we sprayed with 22 ounces of a 5-pound generic glyphosate, as well as a pint of Dual, and these were extend beans, so we got the extended max. And we never went back to this field to spray it again. And that picture is taken in like the 1st of September. And there's that mat of straw that's on the ground there was our weed control for the rest of the year.
When you plant into green, are you guys putting anything on your planters, coulters, row cleaners, running it just with nothing?
We pin our row cleaners up, so nothing. The no-till coulters, I would rip them off the planters and you have it. All you're doing there is you're bringing up a lot of moisture, and you're going to cause more problems with growing it from that standpoint. Good sharp opener blades, opener discs is the answer to be able to cut through that residue.
We went to prescription tillage, stay-rated blades a couple of years ago, and they work really well. I agree 100% with the no row cleaners except for sugar beets, where we have the chaff line behind the combine. I haven't figured out what to do with that yet. We did pro-till one field last fall just to deal with that because the oats were so thick and the chaff line was so thick. I wasn't worried about the oats, but I got 2 birds with one stone, so we did till that one. But row cleaners are seldom needed unless you're going through the chaff line of the combine. In fact, it rides nicer if everything's nice and smooth. And I've seen where row cleaners are set aggressively where you'll have weeds right next to the row, that there's no other weeds because of that beautiful straw mat.
Now, we do use row cleaners on our corn. When we planted corn, we do move a lot of material because we want a nice black strip where that corn is so that ground can warm up for us. That's what we found has worked well.
Just single disc opener on my air drill, and that looks fine. Cuts through real good.
Well, one of the things that we found out is to slow down a little bit and let the opener do its job. We plant a lot more acres now at 4.5 miles an hour than we do at 5 or 5.5. Just slowing down, and the faster you go, the more that row unit wants to ride up and over that residue. At 4.5 miles an hour, the row unit, just everything just smoothing out in the planter. Don't get bouncing, none of that, it just works.
And I think in one of our experiments, I think we discovered that if you have sweet openers, you don't want to use that in rye. Is that? I think we had the grower had sweet openers, and he wasn't getting good seed to soil contact. So if that's what you have on your planter, I would not recommend doing that.
The other thing when you're talking about terminating rye earlier, I probably do need to clarify. You need to know what your cover crop is before you let it go, as long as I'm saying. If you seeded 90 pounds by mistake, you need to terminate that promptly. Yeah, I want 30 pounds or less out there if I'm letting it go. And literally, I can see my soybeans at an angle. If I can't see them, I want that right in.
And you're referring to letting that rye grow with the soybeans in season as they're emerging?
Right, I'm not worried about how soon we do it. If we get a rain, I will not run up the field to kill rye. I don't care when it's killed, if it's a 30-pound rate, and if I can see soybeans. If I can't see soybeans, or it's a heavier rate by mistake, we'll be out there promptly.
See, a lot of times we'll see 100 to 120 pounds of rye because we want to get a lot of biomass, we want a lot of residue, but then we try to terminate that immediately before or immediately following planting. Now, sometimes that doesn't happen. You know, we've let rye grow, similar to what Mike's talking about, and we've seen some yield loss because of that. And I think it had a lot more to do with the shading against the soybeans, fighting for that sunlight. You know, our intent was to get the roller out there and roll it. Of course, that didn't happen because we decided we needed all cows pasture. There's all kinds of other things going on. And so we let that rye break down on its own. And you could see that those beans were stunted a little bit through that season. Now, but that was with a 100-pound seed.
Also, if you kill it before it elongates, it'll dry up in 6 days, and 6 days later, I challenge you to tell me what was there. If you let it elongate, you're going to have straw there all summer.
Yeah, we're going to land rover over all our acres post planting.
We tried a couple hundred acres just to see. We don't have rocks, so we have no other reason to, but just to lay down the straw, and did not see an advantage, I guess.
And like I said, I've got rocks, so I have to rock over it.
We've got quite a few rocks as well, but since we've gone this route, we hardly ever pick rocks anymore.
And I agree. I went out rock picking this fall just because we had time, and I don't remember, it's probably been 3 years since I had to hook up. I had to change the hydraulic hoses because the sun had rotted, and that's how long it's been since rocking. So, before we finish, Melissa, you got to take that guy's name back down there from Roselle County, because I know you're going to have an experiment with Melissa this year coming up, because she's going to get you. You've asked too many questions. Anybody that wants to do anything with the On-Farm Research Network, she makes it real easy. If you've got an idea, like you've heard all morning, some of the different experiments, she'll come in and do all the statistical, she'll do all the planning. All you've got to do is run the tractor through the field. But that's my plug for you guys.
Before we wrap up, I just want to say thank you guys for coming back to the summit. It's great to have you guys back. See you all in person again. Major thanks to all of our producers, our cooperators who are working, doing these trials, and everybody who also contributes to help make these trials happen. If you like, Tim had mentioned, if you guys have any questions about the data or about trials, or if you have something you'd like to try on your farm, give me a call. You can email me or call my cell phone. Get a hold of me. We can try something. It doesn't have to be just cover crops. We can look at other production trials also. And with that, I'd love to hear some of your guys' feedback. If you guys have anything with the presentation, trial, anything you guys would like to do, I think I'm going to open this up a little bit later, or I'll leave this open for a little bit, but I'll take it down off of the PowerPoint so you guys can leave any feedback that you guys might have. But otherwise, I think that'll about wrap it up for this year. Like I said, there are CEU credits in the back. Make sure you guys grab some information, and I hope you guys have a good time with the rest of the conference and enjoy your lunch. And thank you again for coming.